Now let's see the lateral pterygoid muscle. This lateral pterygoid muscle is the key muscle of this region because it provides so many important relations. This lateral pterygoid muscle, it is going to arise from the two head, one lower head and one upper head. The lower head is going to arise from this lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate, and the upper head is going to arise from the infratemporal fossa of the greater wing of the sphenoid along with the infratemporal crest. And both these heads, they are going to converge with each other and going to form a single tendon which passes backward and laterally and going to insert as a single tendon into the pterygoid fovea, which is nothing but it is the depression at the front of the neck of the mandible. Along with this pterygoid fovea, this lateral pterygoid muscle, it is also going to attach with this articular disc of the temporomandibular joint as well as the capsule of the temporomandibular joint. When we talk about the nerve supply of this lateral pterygoid muscle, it is going to be supplied by the direct branch of the anterior division of the mandibular nerve, that is the nerve to lateral pterygoid muscle. When we talk about the action of this lateral pterygoid muscle, it is the only muscle which is responsible for the depression of the mandible. When this muscle get contract, it will carry forward the head of the mandible along with the articular disc, and this will responsible for the elevation of the depressed mandible. When this both the sided lateral pterygoid muscle along with the medial pterygoid muscle of both the sides get contract, it will lead to the protrusion of the mandible. This lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle particularly is responsible for this protrusion. When the lateral pterygoid muscle and the medial pterygoid muscle of the same side, they contract alternatively with the opposite side, it will lead to the side to side movement of the mandible, which is very helpful movement in case of the mastication. Now let's see some important relations of this lateral pterygoid muscle. The structures which lie superficial to this lateral pterygoid muscle, they include the ramus of the mandible along with the masseter muscle and the tendon of the temporalis muscle, which are lying superficial to this lateral pterygoid muscle. When we see the structures present deep to this lateral pterygoid muscle, it includes the mandibular nerve along with its branches, the chorda tympani nerve, stylomandibular ligament, as well as the deep part of the medial pterygoid muscle. The structures which passes below this lateral head of the pterygoid muscle, it includes the maxillary artery and the branch of the maxillary artery, that is the inferior alveolar artery. Along with this structure, one nerve is also passes, that is the inferior alveolar nerve, which is the branch of the posterior division of the mandibular nerve. So let's see these relations. This external carotid artery, it divides into maxillary artery as well as the superficial temporal artery just behind the neck of the mandible, and this maxillary artery, it runs medial to this neck of the mandible and reaches up to the lower border of the lateral pterygoid muscle. From here, this maxillary artery, it passes superficial to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle and reach between the two head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. From here, the artery passes further medially and passes between the two head of this lateral pterygoid muscle to enter into the pterygomaxillary fissure, which ultimately directs the artery into the pterygopalatine fossa. So this lateral pterygoid muscle divides this maxillary artery into three parts by the lower head, and the first part lies below the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. The second part, which lies superficial to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle, and the third part of the maxillary artery, which passes between these two head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. At the lower border of this lateral pterygoid muscle, along with this first part of the maxillary artery, one of the branch of the first part of the maxillary artery, that is the inferior alveolar artery, which also passes, which is going to pass through the medial aspect of the ramus of the mandible to enter into the mandibular foramen. One nerve is also passes along with this, and that is the branch of the posterior division of the mandibular nerve, and that branch, it is the inferior alveolar nerve, which is also accompanying this inferior alveolar artery. Along with this inferior alveolar nerve, the posterior division of the mandibular nerve also gives one branch, and that is the lingual nerve, which also passes to the lower border of the lateral pterygoid muscle. The structures passes between the two head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. It includes the junction between the second and the third part of the maxillary artery. Along with this structure, the buccal branch, it also passes between the two head of the lateral pterygoid muscle, and which is the branch of the anterior division of the mandibular nerve. The structures passes above the upper head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. This include the branch from the second part of the maxillary artery, and that branch, that is the deep temporal artery. Along with this deep temporal artery, the deep temporal nerves are also going to pass from the upper border of the lateral pterygoid muscle. One mesenteric nerve, it also going to coming out from the upper border of this lateral pterygoid muscle to supply the deep surface of the masseter muscle. So all these are the important relations of the lateral pterygoid muscle. You can pause this slide and revise the lateral pterygoid detail. Now let's see the details of the medial pterygoid muscle. Here in this figure, along with the lateral pterygoid muscles and the relation with this lateral pterygoid muscle, we are going to study the medial pterygoid to get better understanding of the position of this muscle. The medial pterygoid muscle, it is going to arise from the two head. One is the superficial head, that is a small head, and one is the deep head, which is a very large head. And both the heads, they are converged like that of the lateral pterygoid muscle to get insert over the mandible. So this is the site from where the superficial head of the medial pterygoid muscle is going to arise, and this is from the maxillary protuberance, which is actually present on the posterior side of the maxilla. The deep head, which is going to arise from the deep to this lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle from the medial surface of the lateral plate of the pterygoid process, and from here this larger head, it is going to pass below this lower border of this lateral pterygoid muscle, and both this head, they are going to converge with each other, and they passes medial to this ramus of the mandible, and it passes downward, backward and laterally, and reach up to the medial surface of the angle of the mandible. So this medial pterygoid muscle, it is going to arise from the superficial head and deep head, and both these heads are going to fuse with each other and passes medial to this ramus of the mandible, passes downward, backward and laterally to insert at the medial surface of the angle of the mandible. When this muscle get contract, it will lead to the elevation of the mandible. Along with the lateral pterygoid muscle, bilateral and simultaneous contraction help to protrude the mandible, and in case of the combination with the lateral pterygoid muscle with alternate contraction of both the sides, they produce the side to side movement of the mandible, which is an important movement in the chewing. This medial pterygoid muscle, it is going to be supplied by the direct branch from the trunk of the mandibular nerve. When we see the relation of this medial pterygoid muscle, laterally it is related with this ramus of the mandible. And along with the ramus of the mandible, it is also related laterally with this lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. Along with them, it is also related laterally with this lingual nerve, inferior alveolar vessels as well as the nerve, and the maxillary artery. When we see the medial relation of this medial pterygoid muscle, it is concerned with the more deepest structures, and these structures include the tensor veli palatini muscle and superior constrictor muscles, which are separated by the styloglossus and stylopharyngeus muscle. So the medial relation of this medial pterygoid muscle, they are related with the pharynx as well as the palatine muscle. Now let's see the attachment of the medial pterygoid muscle with this figure. This is the figure of the skull along with the mandible from below, and the image shows this is the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate, from where the deep head of the medial pterygoid muscle is going to arise, and this is the area from where the superficial head of the medial pterygoid muscle is going to arise, and this is the superficial head, and both the heads, they are going to converge with each other and going to form a single muscle fiber, which are going to insert over the medial surface of the angle of the mandible. And here we can see this is the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle from the lateral surface of the lateral plate of the pterygoid process, and from here the upper head of the lateral pterygoid muscle from the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid as well as the infratemporal crest. And both these heads, they are converge and they pass and going to insert over the pterygoid fovea. Now, after completion of all the four muscles of the mastication, we know that all these muscles are going to arise from the different parts of the skull, and they are going to insert over the mandible, and that's why these muscles are responsible for the movement of the mandible. And out of these four muscles, the lateral pterygoid is the only jaw opener, which is a gravitational movement, while the other three muscles are the jaw closers, which is actually an anti-gravity action. You can pause this slide and revise the medial pterygoid details.